Willie Nelson and Julio, the impossible duet that changed music history. Nobody in the room believed it would work. Not the producers, not the label executives, not even the musicians sitting behind the glass. A Spanish romantic crooner and a weathered Texas outlaw, together on the same track. It was, by every industry standard, a disaster waiting to happen. But nobody had told Julio Iglesias that. Now let me tell you the story of the most unlikely collaboration in music history, and why the world was never quite the same after it. It was 1984. The music industry was in the middle of a revolution. MTV had rewritten the rules. Michael Jackson's Thriller had just sold 66 million copies. Synthesizers were replacing orchestras. Youth was everything. Image was everything. The future belonged to the loud, the young, and the electric. Julio Iglesias was none of those things. He was 40 years old, he sang ballads, he wore suits. His biggest markets were France, Latin America, and Spain. Places that American radio programmers couldn't find on a map without help. CBS Records had signed him to a massive international deal, but cracking the United States remained the one mountain he hadn't climbed. And Willie Nelson? Willie was a different kind of problem entirely. At 51, Willie Nelson was country music royalty, but the complicated, difficult kind. He had fought the Nashville establishment for decades. He had pioneered the outlaw country movement alongside Waylon Jennings. He wore his hair in braids, smoked things that made his management nervous, and operated entirely on his own terms. Two men, two worlds, zero obvious common ground. So how did they end up in the same studio? And why did it change everything? The idea didn't come from a marketing meeting. It didn't come from a focus group or a demographic study. It came, as the best ideas often do, from one person willing to say something that sounded completely insane. Albert Hammond, the British-Spanish songwriter and producer who had been working closely with Julio, had a vision. He believed that Julio's greatest obstacle in America wasn't his accent or his style. It was familiarity. Americans needed a bridge, someone they already trusted to walk them across to this Spanish stranger with the velvet voice. Hammond had written a song, a simple song, almost deceptively simple, a gentle, nostalgic meditation on love and loss, called "To All the Girls I've Loved Before." The melody was warm, the lyrics were universal, and Hammond heard, in his mind, two voices on it, one smooth and continental, one rough and American, like silk and denim sewn together. He pitched the idea to Julio's team. There was silence. Then the question that everyone was thinking, would Willie Nelson actually do this? Willie Nelson, it turned out, had heard Julio Iglesias sing. And Willie Nelson, a man who had spent his entire career defying what people expected of him, thought the idea was perfect, precisely because it made no sense. He said yes almost immediately. But what happened when these two men actually walked into the same room together? That story has never been fully told. The recording took place in 1983, with the release planned for the following year. The studio was in Los Angeles, neutral territory, in a sense, for both men. Those who were present described the atmosphere as quietly electric. Not tense, not awkward, something stranger and more interesting than either of those things. Julio arrived first, immaculate as always, pressed shirt, perfect hair, carrying with him that particular quality he had, the ability to make any room feel like it was being held in the palm of his hand. Willie arrived the way Willie always arrived, unhurried, unbothered, trailing a cloud of easy warmth and absolute self-possession. He shook Julio's hand. They looked at each other. By most accounts, they spoke very little at first. There was a language barrier, not insurmountable, but real. Julio's English was functional but accented. Willie's Spanish was essentially non-existent. And yet within minutes of being in the same room, something was communicating between them that didn't require words. Music, it turns out, has its own grammar. They ran through the song once, separately, then together. The producers in the booth exchanged glances. Something was happening that they hadn't fully anticipated. The contrast between the two voices, Julio's polished Mediterranean warmth and Willie's cracked, lived-in American grain, wasn't creating friction. It was creating chemistry. The kind of chemistry you cannot manufacture. The kind that either exists or it doesn't. The kind that makes everyone in the room go very quiet and very still because they know they are witnessing something that cannot be repeated. They recorded the final version in a handful of takes. It was, by all accounts, almost effortless. But the real drama was still to come. When CBS Records heard the finished track, the reaction was not unanimous celebration. There were executives, powerful ones, who had serious doubts. Country radio wouldn't play it because it was too pop. Pop radio wouldn't play it because it was too country. And both formats, frankly, weren't sure what to do with a Spanish accent in the lead vocal. The demographic math didn't add up on paper. Julio's fanbase skewed older, international, and female. Willie's fanbase skewed older, American, and proudly resistant to anything that smelled like crossover commercialism. Who exactly was this record for? The answer, as it turned out, was everyone, because what the executives with their demographic charts and their format consultants had failed to account for was the most powerful force in the music industry, and in human nature generally: emotion. When people heard those two voices together, when they heard the gentle, almost melancholy beauty of that melody, and felt the weight of all those loves and all those years carried in both voices simultaneously, they didn't think about format. They didn't think about demographics. They just felt something. The single was released in early 1984. Within weeks, it was climbing charts that Julio Iglesias had never appeared on before. Country charts, pop charts, adult contemporary charts. Radio stations that had never played a Julio Iglesias record in their lives were putting it into heavy rotation. And then came the moment that nobody, not even Julio himself, had dared to fully imagine. April 1984. To All the Girls I've Loved Before reached #1 on the Billboard Hot Country Singles chart. Let that land for a moment. A Spanish singer, a man born in Madrid, raised on football and flamenco, who had learned English as his fourth or fifth language, had just topped the American country music chart. Alongside Willie Nelson, yes, but still. The achievement was so improbable that even the trade publications seemed slightly confused about how to report it. Was this a country record? A pop record? A Latin record? A novelty? It was none of those things, and it was all of them. What Julio and Willie had created, perhaps without fully intending to, was a proof of concept for something the music industry had long theorized about, but never quite achieved. A record with no borders. A record that belonged to no genre, and therefore belonged to every listener. The music video aired on MTV. Julio Iglesias, in a suit, with his smile, with his accent, appeared on American television screens in living rooms from Alabama to Alaska. And instead of the resistance that the executives had feared, there was something else entirely. Recognition, warmth, the feeling of meeting someone you somehow already knew. Willie Nelson, in interviews around that time, was characteristically understated about the whole thing. He said something to the effect that he and Julio were really not so different, that they both just sang about the things that mattered to people. Love, loss, time passing, the women you remembered. Julio, for his part, was more expansive. He spoke about the record as a kind of miracle, as evidence that music, real music, music made with genuine feeling, could cross any boundary that human beings had constructed. But there was something else Julio said in one interview that almost nobody noticed at the time. Something that, in retrospect, reveals exactly how much this moment meant to him personally. In a quiet interview given to a Spanish journalist shortly after the record's success, Julio Iglesias said something that stopped the conversation cold. He said that when he first heard the finished recording, when he sat alone in a room and listened to his voice and Willie's voice together for the first time, he thought about the hospital bed. He thought about the guitar placed in his hands by a stranger. He thought about the 2 years of rehabilitation. He thought about every person who had ever looked at him with polite skepticism, every producer who had hesitated, every executive who had doubted, every critic who had dismissed him as a European novelty act with no future in the American market. And he said, quietly, without drama, in the way that people speak when they are telling the absolute truth, that in that moment, listening to that record, he understood something he had always believed but never been able to prove. That the voice they had given him, the voice that had come to him in that hospital room, in the worst moment of his life, was not an accident. It was, he said, the only explanation that made sense. A Spanish boy who should have spent his life as a goalkeeper, a Texas outlaw who should have had nothing in common with him. A song so simple it almost seemed too simple. And somehow, together, They had made something that 300 million people recognized as true. The impossible duet had worked, not despite everything that should have made it fail, but because of it. And the question that lingered, the question that Julio himself never fully answered, was this: if that car accident had never happened, if that guitar had never been placed in his hands, would any of it have existed at all? Some doors, it seems, can only be opened by the ones who have already lost everything.